The Montana wind howled across the Badlands as Josiah Joe Blackwood crawled through the alkali dust. His eyes burned out with acid, and his world plunged into permanent darkness by the sulfuric solution they'd poured across his face. The bitter taste of blood and chemicals filled his mouth as he inched forward, each movement sending waves of agony through his ravaged face. At 59, the former territorial water rights inspector had examined thousands of irrigation claims, prevented countless water wars through careful documentation, and spent 27 years bringing legal order to the chaotic world of frontier water management. But he'd never expected to be blinded and left for dead by his own irrigation company supervisor, betrayed for the crime of refusing to falsify water rights that would steal river access from homesteaders for corporate cattle operations. The memory of that betrayal burned almost as fiercely as the acid had. Joe had dedicated his life to fair water management in a territory where water meant life itself. He'd turned down bribes, weathered threats, and maintained his integrity through droughts and floods alike. His reputation for fairness had made him both respected and resented throughout Montana territory. "You're too principled for modern water management, Blackwood," Supervisor Hartwell had sneered as his hired thugs held Joe down and poured the burning acid across his eyes. The men had laughed as Joe screamed, their grip tightening as he thrashed against the searing pain. "This territory's got no use for inspectors who can't tell the difference between water rights and water profits." Joe remembered Hartwell's expensive suit, the gold watch chain that had glinted in the lamplight as he supervised the torture, the smell of expensive cologne mingling with the acrid stench of the acid. Hartwell had built his career on corruption, using his position to enrich himself while destroying the livelihoods of those who stood in his way. The profits had been Hartwell's scheme to divert entire river systems away from small homesteads, redirecting the water to massive cattle operations owned by Eastern investors. The plan would have turned thriving family farms into dust while filling Hartwell's pockets with kickbacks from grateful cattle barons. When Joe discovered the conspiracy and refused to certify the fraudulent water claims, Hartwell had decided that a tragic irrigation accident would solve his problem permanently. "Should have stuck to measuring water instead of measuring my integrity." Hartwell had laughed as they loaded Joe onto a supply wagon and dumped him in the wilderness. Joe remembered the rough hands that had thrown him onto the hard wooden bed of the wagon, the jolting pain as they'd driven recklessly over rough terrain, deliberately hitting every rut and hole to increase his suffering. "Maybe the buzzards will appreciate your attention to legal detail." Now Joe dragged himself through the sage and buffalo grass, his destroyed eyes weeping constantly from the chemical burns, his world reduced to sound, smell, and touch as he navigated by instinct toward what he hoped was water. His parched throat burned with thirst, his skin cracked and bleeding from exposure to the harsh elements. The sun beat down mercilessly, adding to his misery as he fought to stay conscious. In the distance, he heard the blessed sound of a creek flowing, the first sign of hope he'd encountered since crawling away from Hartwell's torture chamber. He followed the sound, his fingers brushing against rough prairie grass, sharp rocks, and occasionally the smooth coolness of a snake slithering away from his approach. The scent of water grew stronger, mingling with the earthy smell of cultivated soil and growing crops. Joe's heart quickened with hope as he realized he must be approaching a homestead. The homestead sat beside a natural spring, surrounded by carefully maintained irrigation channels and thriving crops that spoke of someone who understood both water management and agricultural science. The channels were expertly designed, following the natural contours of the land while maximizing water efficiency. Even in his blindness, Joe could sense the precision of the work, the careful planning that had gone into creating this oasis in the harsh Montana landscape. Joe collapsed at the wooden porch steps, his blood staining the planks that bore the smooth finish of expert craftsmanship. His strength finally gave out, his body surrendering to the trauma and exhaustion of his ordeal. As consciousness began to slip away, he heard footsteps approaching. Light but purposeful, the stride of someone who moved with confidence on their own land. The door opened, and he heard a woman's voice, strong but gentle. "Sweet Mother of God." What happened to you? The voice carried both authority and compassion, the tone of someone accustomed to handling emergencies without panic. Water supervisor. Joe gasped through swollen lips, each word sending fresh pain through his ravaged face. My own supervisor. Tried to kill me. The effort of speaking nearly overwhelmed him, darkness threatening to claim him completely. The woman, he'd later learn her name was Elena Vasquez, helped him inside with surprising strength. Her hands were calloused but gentle as she lifted him, guiding him through the doorway with careful movements that minimized his pain. Her home was well organized and comfortable, and he could smell the clean scent of properly managed water systems and the lingering aroma of fresh bread that spoke of someone who understood how to make the desert bloom. Your own supervisor did this to your eyes? She asked, examining his injuries with hands that moved with gentle competence. Her fingers probed delicately around the damaged tissue, assessing the extent of his injuries with professional precision. Caught him. Stealing water rights, Joe managed to explain, his voice barely above a whisper. Didn't appreciate my interference. The words seemed inadequate to describe the magnitude of Hartwell's betrayal, but they were all he could manage before pain overwhelmed him again. Lena's voice carried the hard edge of recognition. She'd seen this kind of systematic water theft before. The calculated cruelty of men who used legal positions to justify stealing the lifeblood of frontier communities. Ladrones, she said quietly, using the Spanish word for thieves. They'd steal the rain from the sky if they could find a way to charge for it. Joe felt her hands working quickly, cleaning his wounds with something that smelled of herbs and alcohol. The liquid stung, but the pain was clean and honest, unlike the burning agony of the acid. He heard water being poured, cloth being wrung out, the soft clink of glass bottles being opened. Lena worked methodically, her movements efficient and purposeful. Rest now, she told him, her voice firm but kind. You're safe here. I'll tend to your wounds. For 4 months, Joe drifted between consciousness and fever, while Lena tended his wounds with a mixture of frontier medicine and traditional Mexican remedies her grandmother had taught her. The infection that had set in required constant attention, with poultices changed regularly and herbal teas administered to fight the fever that threatened to claim his life. She couldn't restore his sight, too much damage had been done, but she managed to save his life and help him adapt to his new world of darkness. During his more lucid moments, Joe learned about his savior through fragments of conversation and the sounds of her daily routine. Lena rose before dawn each day, checking her irrigation systems before the heat of the day made work unbearable. She spoke to her crops in a mixture of English and Spanish, her voice taking on a different quality when she used her native tongue. In the evenings, she would read aloud from books on agriculture, water management, and occasionally poetry, her voice washing over Joe like a soothing balm. When Joe finally sat up clear-headed, his fever broken and his strength slowly returning, he found Lena conducting what sounded like a comprehensive water rights inspection. Her voice moving through technical terminology as she examined irrigation systems with systematic precision. Her homestead was more than just a farm. It was a model of how water management could serve entire communities, rather than just wealthy interests. You know water law, he observed, listening to her professional assessment of flow rates and legal documentation. Her terminology was precise, her understanding of water rights clearly based on both practical experience and formal knowledge. I know enough to keep water flowing to the people who need it most, Lena replied, and he could hear her organizing legal documents with scientific care. Papers rustled as she sorted them into what sounded like a well-organized filing system. Out here, stolen water means stolen lives. Her story emerged slowly through their conversations over the following weeks. Lena was the daughter of Mexican water engineers whose knowledge of irrigation dated back to Spanish colonial times. Her family had managed complex water systems in northern Mexico before political unrest forced them to flee across the border. She'd married an American water rights lawyer who'd been killed in a deliberately caused flash flood when he'd tried to expose systematic water theft by major cattle operations. Leaving her to continue his work with nothing but her inherited knowledge and her determination to protect small farmers' water rights. "Gringos think Mexican women can't understand water law," she explained one evening as they sat on the porch, the cooling air bringing relief after a scorching day. He could hear her checking flow measurements with professional instruments, the scratch of her pencil as she recorded the data in a ledger. "They learn different, or they learn to dig their own wells." Joe told her about Hartwell's conspiracy, the diverted rivers, the years of honest inspection repaid with blinding. He described the elaborate scheme to redirect entire watersheds, the falsified documents that would have stripped water rights from generations of homesteaders, the bribes offered to look the other way. Lena listened without judgment, occasionally making sounds of recognition as if she'd suspected such systematic theft existed. "This Supervisor Hartwell thinks water belongs only to whoever can pay the most," she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of disgust and resignation. "He thinks I'm a fool for believing in legal water rights," Joe replied, running his fingers along the smooth wood of the porch railing. "Too rigid to understand that water inspection is about serving corporate interests, not protecting homesteaders." "Maybe he's right about one thing," Lena said, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe the old way of water management is finished. Question is, what are you going to measure to replace it?" That question hung between them. A challenge and an invitation. Joe had lost his sight, but his knowledge remained intact. His fingers, now more sensitive than ever, could still detect the subtle differences in soil moisture, water flow, and channel construction that told the true story of water management. His memory of water law was encyclopedic, his understanding of territorial regulations unmatched. Their partnership began when a series of drought-induced water shortages threatened to destroy the entire valley's agricultural community, with small farmers losing their crops, while corporate cattle operations continued to receive unlimited water access. Desperate homesteaders began arriving at Lena's door, seeking help as their wells ran dry and their crops withered. Joe's knowledge of water law and federal irrigation requirements, combined with Lena's understanding of traditional water management and community organizing, allowed them to establish new distribution systems that served all water users fairly. Together, they mapped the valley's water resources, identifying illegal diversions and documenting water theft with meticulous precision. Joe taught Lena the finer points of territorial water law, while she showed him how to use his other senses to continue his work despite his blindness. They developed a system where Lena would describe the visual elements of irrigation systems, while Joe applied his expertise to identify legal violations and potential solutions. "You still know your trade," Lena observed as they worked together to restore water access to desperate homesteaders. She guided his hands to feel the flow of a newly constructed irrigation channel, allowing him to assess its efficiency through touch. "No water rights, no federal law, know how to read the truth when flow measurements lie," Joe replied, running his sensitive fingers along irrigation channels with practiced expertise. The texture of the soil, the temperature of the water, the sound of the flow, all provided information his eyes once would have gathered. "Out here, that's still worth something." Word spread through the Montana Territory about the homestead at Bone Creek Valley, where Lena Vasquez and the blind inspector could solve problems that had stumped territorial water authorities for years. Farmers traveled for days to seek their help, bringing stories of dried-up wells, diverted streams, and corrupt officials who looked the other way while corporate interests stole their water. Joe and Lena listened to each case, documented the evidence, and developed solutions that combined legal expertise with practical water management. They developed a reputation for fairness that extended from the Yellowstone River to the Canadian border. Their methods weren't always conventional. Joe's blindness had forced them to develop new techniques for assessing water systems, but their results were undeniable. Farms that had been on the verge of failure began to thrive again. Communities that had been fighting over dwindling water resources found ways to share equitably, and corrupt officials discovered that their schemes were being exposed and documented with damning precision. More importantly, they found in each other something they'd both thought lost: professional companionship, shared purpose, and the deep love that comes from protecting the vulnerable together in a world that seemed determined to steal their most basic needs. Their relationship grew naturally from their shared work, built on mutual respect and understanding. Joe admired Lena's resilience and expertise, while she valued his unwavering commitment to justice, despite the terrible price he'd paid for it. The confrontation with Supervisor Hartwell came 2 years later. He arrived with territorial officials and forged documents, claiming Joe was mentally incompetent due to his injuries and needed to be placed under Hartwell's care as his former supervisor. The sound of approaching horses had alerted them, giving Lena time to position herself strategically, while Joe waited on the porch, his face impassive despite the surge of emotion he felt at hearing his tormentor's voice again. "There's the old blind man," Hartwell announced, and Joe could hear the sneer in his voice. The creak of expensive leather boots on hard-packed earth told Joe that Hartwell had dismounted, approaching with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. Living in squalor with some Mexican farm woman probably can't even tell water from whiskey anymore. Joe emerged from the homestead, no longer the broken man Hartwell had tortured and abandoned. Hard work and purpose had strengthened his body, while finding his true calling had restored his confidence. His sight was gone forever, but his other senses had sharpened, and his voice carried the authority of genuine expertise. "Hartwell," he said calmly, turning his scarred face toward the sound of the man's voice. "You're sounding prosperous. The water-stealing business treating you well? Don't get smart with me, Blackwood. I'm here on official territorial business." Hartwell's voice carried a note of surprise. He clearly hadn't expected to find Joe so recovered, so confident. "Official?" Lena's voice came from beside him, and he could hear her rifle being cocked. The metallic sound echoed in the quiet yard, making Hartwell's men shift nervously. "Funny thing about that. I sent some documentation to friends in Helena and Denver. Seems the federal government's been investigating water rights fraud." Hartwell's confidence seemed to waver. Joe could hear it in the change in his breathing pattern, the slight shuffle of his feet as he reconsidered his position. They'd been building a case against him for months, with Lena's connections throughout the farming community, providing access to stolen water documentation and witness testimony that painted a clear picture of systematic irrigation theft. "This is a setup," Hartwell sputtered, and Joe could hear his hand moving toward his gun, the subtle rustle of fabric as he reached for his weapon. "No," came a new voice from what sounded like the barn area. Boots crunched on gravel as several men emerged from hiding. "This is justice." A federal marshal's voice carried across the farmyard, flanked by territorial investigators and several angry farmers who discovered Hartwell's plan to use their water systems as cover for his systematic theft operation. The marshal read out a list of charges that included fraud, corruption, assault, and attempted murder. Each charge was supported by meticulous documentation that Joe and Lena had compiled over the past 2 years. The confrontation ended without violence. Faced with overwhelming evidence and expert testimony, Hartwell's empire of water theft collapsed completely. His conspiracy had reached far beyond the original river diversions, involving systematic stealing of water rights across multiple territories that had destroyed thousands of farms and ruined countless families. He died in federal prison 2 years later, still claiming he'd only been trying to improve Montana's agricultural efficiency. "Feel better?" Lena asked as they listened to the federal party disappear across the valley, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. They stood together on the porch, the setting sun warming their faces as a gentle breeze carried the scent of their thriving crops. "Feel clear-sighted," Joe replied, touching his scarred face. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd gained a different kind of vision through his blindness, one that saw beyond appearances to the truth of things. "For the first time since they blinded me, I feel like I can truly see what matters." Their partnership deepened into something more profound than business or convenience. They established a water rights service that served the entire territory, providing legal documentation and irrigation consulting to anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay standard fees. Their home became a center for water education, where farmers could learn sustainable irrigation techniques and legal strategies to protect their rights. "We make quite a team," Lena observed one evening as they sat by the creek, listening to the water flow through their carefully maintained channels. The sound of the water provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation, a constant reminder of the life-giving resource they dedicated themselves to protecting. "We make flow," Joe corrected, taking her calloused hand in his scarred one. Their hands fit together perfectly, both shaped by years of hard work and dedication to the land, the kind that nourishes rather than steals, that sustains rather than starves. At 61, Josiah Blackwood was no longer the broken-down inspector who'd been blinded and left for dead by a corrupt supervisor. He was a guardian of water rights, a protector of agricultural communities, and living proof that expertise could transcend physical limitations. His blindness, intended to end his career and his life, had instead opened new pathways of perception and understanding. The valley that had nearly claimed his life had instead given him purpose, partnership, and the chance to use his knowledge for something greater than mere water measurement. He'd found a way to continue his life's work, not despite his blindness but through it, developing new methods of water assessment that combined his legal expertise with his heightened senses of touch, hearing, and smell. And Elena Vasquez had found something she'd thought impossible, not just love, but professional partnership with someone who saw her Mexican heritage as strength rather than liability, who understood that the strongest communities are built on fair access to water and respect for those who understand that true prosperity flows from justice, not theft. Her knowledge, once dismissed because of her gender and ethnicity, was now recognized throughout the territory as invaluable. Together, they'd carved out their own piece of the American dream, in the fertile beauty of Montana's high country, proving that sometimes the people society discards become the ones who channel the most life-giving streams. Their homestead became a landmark on the frontier, Bone Creek Valley water rights, where irrigation justice and agricultural excellence went hand in hand. The supply wagons still rolled past their valley, carrying goods and dreams across the expanding West. But now they carried something else as well. The knowledge that there were still places where water rights mattered more than corporate profits, where destroyed eyes couldn't destroy an unbreakable commitment to fairness, and where two people who'd been written off by the world proved that the most valuable flows are those that reach everyone who needs them, that nourish rather than deprive, and that operate on the unwavering principle that in America, water belongs not just to those who can afford to steal it, but to all who work the land, tend the crops, and understand that every drop is sacred, every right is precious, and every person deserves access to the flowing gift that makes life possible in the harsh but beautiful landscape of the American frontier.